The heat in Hollow Bend had a weight to it. It settled on a man's shoulders like a yoke and pressed the dust of the street into a fine, choking powder that tasted of grit and dead dreams. Summer of 1888 in the Wyoming Territory was baked clean through. The creek was a memory, a scar of cracked mud winding behind the town, and the sun was a merciless white eye in a bleached blue sky. It had been a long drought, the kind that frayed tempers and shrunk souls, but there was another kind of heat in the air, a fever of speculation. The railroad was coming. Surveyors had driven their stakes a few miles south, and that thin line of wooden markers was changing everything. Land that was once worth nothing more than the sweat it took to work, it was now a prize. Greed, once a quiet sin whispered in parlors, was now shouted in the saloon. Mercy Dunn felt the town's heat in the stares that followed her down the main street. She was a woman built on a scale the sun could not shrink, tall and broad-shouldered, with hands that could soothe a calf, wring a chicken's neck, or knead a dozen loaves of bread with equal competence. Her father, a man of big ideas and flimsy follow-through, had left her with two things: a small, poor parcel of grazing land by the dry creek bed and a mountain of debt. The debt was owed to Earl Gibbons, a man who owned the mercantile, the bank, and the smug expression he wore like a permanent fixture. The whispers followed her like flies, not just about the debt, but about her size. They said her shadow could cover a whole vegetable patch. They joked that when she stepped on the mercantile's porch, the whole building groaned. Mercy had learned long ago to build a wall of silence around herself. She did her business, her face set in a calm, neutral mask, her gaze fixed on her destination. She did not give them the satisfaction of a flinch or a tear. Her strength was her shield, and her competence was her pride. She knew how to manage stock, how to make a garden grow in stubborn soil, and how to cook a meal that could make a man forget his troubles. These were real things, solid things, not like the whispers that were as thin and meaningless as the dust in the air. Today, however, the whispers felt sharper, heavier. They were leading up to something. The day her father's debt came fully due. She walked toward the center of town, where the sheriff's office and the saloon faced each other across the dusty expanse. A small crowd had gathered on the saloon porch. Earl Gibbons was there, looking pleased with himself, his belly straining the buttons of his waistcoat. Beside him stood the county magistrate, a man whose face was a web of broken veins and whose justice was for sale to the highest bidder. Mercy stopped, her heart a slow, heavy drum in her chest. She knew what this was. They called it a labor auction, a local custom for settling debts when coin was scarce. It was a pretty name for a cruel practice. They would sell her time, her sweat, her skills, to anyone who would pay Gibbons for the privilege. It was a way to break a person's spirit while claiming to uphold the law. The magistrate cleared his throat, his voice raspy. "Hear ye, by the authority of this county, we are here to settle the outstanding debt of the late Patrick Dunn, owed to Mr. Earl Gibbons. The debt stands at $200. His sole heir, Miss Mercy Dunn, being without funds, will offer her labor to the good people of Hollow Bend." Gibbons smiled, a slick, unpleasant motion of his lips. "She's a strong one," he called out, his voice booming with false cheer. "Good for cooking, cleaning, laundry. Can lift a barrel of flour without breaking a sweat. I'd wager who'll start the bidding for a year of her services." A few snickers rippled through the crowd. Men nudged each other. Sadie Miller, the mercantile owner's wife, watched from her doorway with a look of pinched satisfaction. Mercy stood alone in the sun, feeling the humiliation crawl over her skin like fire ants. She squared her shoulders. She would not let them see her break. She would endure this, just as she had endured everything else. A voice cut through the murmur, quiet but clear. "There will be no auction today." Every head turned. He came from the direction of the sheriff's office, walking with a slight, uneven gait. Sheriff Eli Carter was not an imposing man. He was lean, almost gaunt, and shorter than most of the men on the porch. His face was all sharp angles and shadows under a worn hat, and his left leg dragged just a little, a souvenir from a silver mine explosion the year before. But his eyes, steady and gray as river stones, missed nothing. His reputation was bigger than he was. He had been the man who faced down the Red Jack gang on the high trail, and he had done it with quiet resolve, not loud bluster. Gibbons puffed out his chest. "Sheriff, this is a legal proceeding, a civil matter." Eli Carter stopped a few feet from the magistrate. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. "Magistrate, are you aware of Territorial Statute 47, passed last spring?" The magistrate blinked, his face flushing. "I am familiar with all the relevant statutes, Sheriff." "Then you must be aware," Eli continued in that same calm tone, "that debt peonage was outlawed. A man, or a woman, cannot be forced into labor to settle a debt. You can seize property, you can garnish wages, but you cannot sell their time. It's a form of slavery, and the territory has no stomach for it." A thick silence fell over the street. Gibbons's smile had vanished, replaced by a tight, angry line. He had counted on local custom, on the fact that news from the territorial capital traveled slow. He had not counted on the sheriff reading the new laws. "This is just an arrangement," Gibbons sputtered. "A chance for the girl to make good on her father's name." "She can make good on it by earning a fair wage," Eli said. He turned his gaze, for the first time, directly to Mercy. His eyes held no pity, only a straightforward assessment. "Miss Dunn, I understand you're a fine cook." Mercy was so surprised she could only nod. "The county livery needs a cook," he said, "for the hostlers and the men who ride patrol. It pays $10 a month, plus board. The wage is yours. You can make arrangements with Mr. Gibbons to pay what you owe him. That is the proper way to handle it." He had not saved her. He had offered her a tool, a means to save herself. He had upheld the law, coolly and cleanly, and in doing so, had dismantled the whole humiliating spectacle. The crowd began to disperse, deprived of their entertainment. They shuffled away, avoiding Gibbons's furious glare. Gibbons stepped down from the porch, his face mottled with rage. He got close to Eli, his voice a low hiss. "You've made an enemy today. Carter, that was my money." "It's still your money," Eli replied, unmoved. "You'll just have to wait for it. The law says so." He then looked at Mercy. "The old storage shed behind my office is empty. It's not much, but it's dry. You can move your things in there. The kitchen is at the livery. You can start tomorrow." He tipped his hat, a small, formal gesture, and turned, walking back to his office with that same uneven rhythm. Mercy stood for a moment longer, the dust settling around her. She had been braced for shame, for a year of servitude. Instead, she had a job. She had a roof over her head, however humble, and she had a new set of whispers to follow her. The talk shifted as she walked to her father's small, mortgaged house to gather her meager belongings. Now she was not just the big woman, the debtor. She was the sheriff's project. Sadie Miller watched her pass, whispering to a customer. "Imagine the grocery bill for that one. She'll eat the county blind." Another man at the saloon laughed. "Carter must like 'em sturdy. Less chance of 'em blowing away in the wind." The words were different, but the sentiment was the same. She was an object of speculation, a curiosity. By late afternoon, she had moved. The storage shed was little more than a box of sun-bleached planks. It had a cot, a small table, and a single window facing the alley behind the jail. It smelled of dust and disuse, but it was hers, a space where she could close the door and be alone. As she swept the floor, the setting sun cast long shadows down the alley. She felt the weight of Gibbons's anger, a palpable thing that seemed to linger in the air. She felt the scorn of the town, a constant, low hum of disapproval. But beneath it all, There was a small, unfamiliar flicker of something else. Hope, maybe, or just the simple relief of having a choice. Night fell, but the heat did not break. A hot wind blew in from the plains, rattling the loose boards of the shed and carrying the scent of sagebrush. Mercy lay on the narrow cot, listening to the sounds of the town shutting down, the tinny piano from the saloon, a dog barking in the distance, the lonely cry of a coyote. She was tired, a deep bone weariness that went beyond the day's labor. She was drifting toward sleep when a new sound pricked her ears. It was quiet, almost lost in the wind, the soft tread of a horse, walking slowly down the alley behind her shed. Not the steady clip-clop of a horse on the main street, but a stealthy, deliberate pace. It stopped somewhere in the darkness just beyond her window. She held her breath, listening. There was no sound of a rider dismounting, no jingle of spurs, just the quiet snuffle of the horse and the creak of saddle leather. Mercy sat up slowly, her heart beginning to pound. It could be anyone, a late traveler, a drunk finding his way home. But her instincts told her otherwise. The furtiveness of it, the silence. Someone was out there, in the dark, watching her new home. The night no longer felt like a reprieve. It felt like a threat, long and dark and full of unseen eyes. She was no longer just in debt. She was in trouble. The livery stable kitchen had been forgotten by God and man. A film of greasy dust covered every surface. The stove was choked with old ash, and a mouse had started a family in the flour bin. Mercy Dunn surveyed the scene not with despair, but with the quiet focus of a general planning a campaign. This was a problem that could be solved with soap, water, and work. And work was something Mercy understood. She spent the first morning in a fury of cleaning. She hauled out buckets of ash, scrubbed the iron stove until it shone a dull black, and scoured the pots and pans down to the bare metal. The two hostlers, a grizzled old man named Silas and a boy of 17 named Matthew, watched her from the stable doorway with open skepticism. They were used to a succession of drifters who called themselves cooks, men who could barely boil water and whose primary skill was complaining. They saw Mercy, a woman of her size, and assumed she was just another mouth to feed, and a large one at that. They stopped watching when the scent of baking bread began to fill the stable, a warm, yeasty aroma that spoke of home and comfort. For lunch, she served them thick slices of it alongside a pot of beans simmered with bacon and molasses. They ate without a word, their eyes wide with surprise. When they were done, Silas wiped his mouth on his sleeve and gave a single, gruff nod. "It'll do," he said, which from him was the highest praise. Mercy's days settled into a rhythm. Up before dawn to start the coffee and the breakfast biscuits, a hearty lunch for the men, a simple supper, and then the long, quiet evenings in her small shed. She worked with a silent efficiency that left no room for conversation. She did not ask for help, and she did not offer unsolicited opinions. She simply did her job, and she did it well. This quiet competence began to earn her a measure of respect from the men she fed. They started leaving fresh water for her by the kitchen door and told her which of the chickens was the best layer. They were small gestures, but in a place like Hollow Bend, they were not insignificant. Eli Carter kept his distance, but Mercy felt his presence. He would sometimes eat with his men, sitting at the end of the long wooden table in the kitchen. He ate what was served, his gaze thoughtful. Their conversations were brief and to the point. One afternoon, he came to the kitchen door as she was kneading dough, her arms dusted with flour to the elbows. "The shed is secure?" he asked without preamble. "It has a door," she answered, not stopping her work. He held out a small, iron key. "Now it has a lock. Use it." He placed the key on the table, along with $2 silver. "First week's pay. You'll need supplies." "It's only been 4 days," she said, surprised. "I trust you not to run off," he said, a faint hint of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "The food's too good." The dry humor was unexpected. It was a joke, but it was also a compliment, and she found herself at a loss for a reply. He tipped his hat and left before she could find one. Their interactions were like that, short, practical, with an undercurrent of something she couldn't quite name. It was not kindness, not exactly. It was respect. He treated her not as a problem to be solved or an object of pity, but as a person with a job to do. He had given her a key, a wage, and a boundary. And in doing so, he had given her a foothold on her own dignity. The town, however, was not so respectful. When Mercy went to the mercantile for supplies, the whispers still followed her. Sadie Miller, the proprietor's wife, watched with narrowed eyes as Mercy requested 20 pounds of flour and 10 pounds of sugar. My, Sadie said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "Feeding the entire territory, are we, dear?" Mercy looked her straight in the eye. "The county has a budget for it," she said evenly, and handed over the money Eli had given her. Sadie's smile tightened. She directed a young clerk, a boy with mean eyes and a weak chin, to fetch the supplies. As Mercy turned to leave, her arms full, the clerk moved to block her path, pretending to stack crates. He jostled her arm, hard, sending a sack of beans spilling across the floorboards. "Watch where you're going," he sneered. "A person could get run down." A few customers snickered. Mercy felt a hot flush of anger rise in her cheeks. For a moment, she was tempted to say something, to use the strength in her arms to give the boy a shove he wouldn't soon forget. But she caught herself. That was what they wanted. They wanted a scene. They wanted to see the big woman lose her temper. Instead, she knelt down, her movements deliberate and calm, and began to scoop the beans back into the sack, one handful at a time. Her silence was a rebuke, a wall they could not penetrate. The boy, denied his sport, stalked away muttering. The pressure from Merle Gibbons was more direct. He approached her one afternoon as she was drawing water from the well behind the livery. He was dressed in a fine suit, despite the heat, and he smelled of bay rum and avarice. "Miss Dunn," he began, his tone unctuous, "I have a proposition for you." Mercy continued to pull the rope. "Hand over hand, I'm not interested." "You haven't heard it yet," he said, his smile unwavering. "It concerns your father's land, that little patch of nothing by the creek. It's worthless, as you know, but for sentimental reasons. I am prepared to take it off your hands. I will consider your father's debt paid in full. You'll be free and clear." Mercy stopped and looked at him. The land was all she had left of her father. It was poor grazing, true, but it was hers, and she knew Gibbons. He was not a sentimental man. If he wanted something, it was because it had value. "The land is not for sale," she said. His smile soured. "A foolish girl, just like your father. I'm trying to help you. I have acquired the original promissory note he signed. It is a legally binding document. I can make things very difficult for you. Sheriff Carter says I am to pay you from my wages, and that's what I will do." She said. She hefted the full bucket of water, turned her back on him, and walked away. His eyes on her back felt like a physical weight. The drought wore on, and the land grew more desperate. The constant wind carried the scent of dust and decay. One evening, a rancher rode into town, his face grim, to report that wolves had gotten into his flock, killing a dozen sheep. A posse was formed, and Eli rode out with them, his face set in tired lines. The threat of the wolves was a constant, low-level fear that hung over the small ranches surrounding Hollow Bend. It was another reminder that survival here was a battle fought on all fronts, against the elements, against the predators in the wild, and against the predators in town. The dust storm came on a moonless night. It started as a low moan on the horizon, the wind picking up, tasting of grit. Soon the air was thick and yellow. a churning wall of sand and soil that blotted out the stars. Mercy had secured the shutters on her small shed and was listening to the wind shriek around the corners of the building when a sudden unease took hold of her. The horses at the livery. Matthew was young and Silas was old. They might need help. Pulling a thick shawl over her head and tying it fast, she stepped out into the gale. The wind tore at her, and she had to lean into it to stay on her feet. The air was so thick with dust she could barely see the faint glow of the lamp in the sheriff's office a few yards away. She fought her way toward the livery, her eyes slitted against the stinging sand. As she passed the squat, windowless shape of the county granary, she saw it, a brief, shielded flicker of light, almost instantly swallowed by the swirling dust. She froze. No one had any reason to be at the granary in a storm like this. Holding her shawl tight against her face, she crept closer, using the side of the building to shield her from the worst of the wind. The light was gone, but as her eyes adjusted, she saw a dark shape hurrying away, disappearing into the maelstrom. Her heart pounded. She felt her way along the wall to the heavy wooden door of the granary. She ran her hand over the rough planks. There, low down near the latch, her fingers came away black and greasy. Soot. A mark had been drawn on the door. A crude cross. She knew what it meant. It was a target. Someone was going to burn the county's grain. With the drought, grain was as precious as gold. An act of arson like this would cause panic and drive prices sky high. And she knew who had the most to gain from that. Earl Gibbons. She didn't think twice. She turned and ran, stumbling through the blinding dust, toward the light in the sheriff's office. She pounded on the door with both fists, shouting his name over the howl of the storm. The door was flung open. Eli stood there, a lamp held high, his face grim. "Mercy, what is it?"
"The granary," she gasped, pulling the shawl from her face. "Someone's marked it. To be burned. I saw a man."
He pulled her inside, his grip firm on her arm.
"You're sure?"
"I felt the soot mark myself," she said, showing him her blackened fingertips. His eyes hardened. He didn't doubt her for a second. They'll wait until the storm is at its worst, thinking no one will see the smoke until it's too late. He grabbed his gun belt from a hook on the wall. "They have to get inside first. We'll be waiting for them." He led the way, not back out the front, but through a door at the back of his office that led to the jail cells and then out into the alley. The storm was a roaring beast, but here, between the buildings, they were slightly sheltered. They made their way to the side of the granary, to a small, seldom used door. Eli worked the lock and pushed it open. Inside, it was pitch black and smelled of dry grain and burlap. "Stay by the door," he whispered, his voice close to her ear. "When he comes in, I'll take him. Just be ready." They waited in the suffocating darkness, the only sound the screaming of the wind outside. The minutes stretched into an eternity. This was a different kind of closeness from their brief exchanges in the kitchen. Here, in the dark, with a shared purpose and a shared danger. They were simply two people against a threat. He was the law, and she was a witness. But it felt like more than that. It felt like they were on the same side of a line that had just been drawn in the dirt. Finally, they heard the scrape of the bar on the main door being lifted. The door creaked open, letting in a swirl of dust and a hunched figure carrying a shielded lantern and a can of oil. As the man stepped inside and slid the door shut, Eli moved. He was a shadow detaching from the other shadows, fast and silent despite his bad leg. There was a short, sharp scuffle, a grunt of surprise, and the thud of a body hitting the floor. Mercy moved then, her solid form blocking the door. Just in case. The man on the floor was one of Gibbons' cronies, a loafer she'd seen hanging around the saloon. Eli had him pinned, his face pressed to the floorboards. The next morning, the wind had died, leaving a thick blanket of dust on everything. The sky was a pale, washed-out gray. Eli marched the prisoner to the magistrate's office, with Mercy following as the sole witness. the hearing was a farce. The magistrate listened with a bored expression as Mercy told her story. The prisoner, whose name was Cole, claimed he had just been seeking shelter from the storm. And the soot mark, Eli asked, his voice tight with contempt. "Just a doodle?" Cole said with a smirk. "No law against doodling. Is there?" The magistrate banged his gavel. "There is no proof of intent to commit a crime. Case dismissed." He refused to even look at Eli. Cole swaggered out of the office. As he passed the mercantile, he gave a nearly imperceptible nod to Earl Gibbons, who was standing on the porch, watching the proceedings with a smug look on his face. The connection was as plain as day. Eli stood on the steps of the office, his hands clenched into fists. He looked over at Mercy, his gray eyes burning with a cold fire. "It's not just one man," he said, his voice low. "I know," Mercy said, her own voice steady. She looked from the smirking face of Gibbons to the quiet, resolute anger of the sheriff. She had come to Hollow Bend seeking only to pay a debt. She saw now that she was part of something much larger, a fight for the soul of the town itself, and she was no longer standing alone. The railroad surveyors arrived on a Tuesday, looking as out of place in Hollow Bend as a trio of peacocks in a chicken coop. They wore city clothes, their boots thin-soled and ill-suited for the dust, and they carried strange instruments on tripods that they peered through with one eye closed. They hammered stakes into the baked earth with a rhythmic, methodical clang that announced the future was no longer a rumor. It was being measured and marked for delivery. The town's low hum of speculation became a feverish roar overnight. Men who had spent their lives complaining about the worthless dirt under their fingernails now paced the boundaries of their small holdings with hungry eyes. The surveyor's presence made Earl Gibbons expansive. He walked the main street as if he had personally laid every tie and driven every spike. He was seen in deep conversation with the lead surveyor, pointing toward the dry creek bed, his gestures broad and proprietary. He was no longer just a merchant. He was a visionary, a builder of empires, and his empire was being built on the hopes and fears of his neighbors. The talk in town took on a new, sharper edge, and much of it was directed at the sheriff's office and the small shed behind it. Mercy's position, once a source of mild curiosity, was now a matter of intense public interest. She was the woman the sheriff had saved. She was the cook he had installed in the county's kitchen. Their brief, practical conversations were spun into elaborate fictions over the counters of the mercantile and the bar of the saloon. "He's sweet on her, you mark my words," Sadie Miller declared to a captive audience of 2 women, all of them pretending to inspect a bolt of calico. "A man doesn't go to that kind of trouble for just anyone. He's fattening her up for himself." The women tittered, their laughter like the rustle of dry leaves. Mercy heard it all. She felt it in the way people's eyes slid away from her when she approached, in the sudden silences that fell when she entered a room. The whispers were no longer just about her size. They were about her character, her relationship with the one man who had shown her a particle of legal decency. The shame of it was a different kind, stickier and more pervasive than the humiliation of the auction block. One evening, sitting on the edge of her cot in the suffocating heat of the shed, she felt a wave of despair so profound it almost buckled her. It would be so easy to give in, to sell the worthless land to Gibbons, take what little she had, and disappear. Find some other dusty town where no one knew her name or the size of her father's debts. She closed her eyes, and an image of her mother came to her, sharp and clear. Her mother, a woman who had been worn down by this same hard land, standing by the stove, her hands covered in flour. She remembered her mother's voice, quiet but firm, from a long time ago. "Mercy, child. Weakness isn't about being heavy or light. Weakness is when you let the words of others decide who you are. You stand on your own 2 feet. They're strong enough." The memory was like a drink of cool water. Mercy opened her eyes. The shed was still small. The air was still hot, but something inside her had shifted. The land was more than just dirt. It was the last piece of her family, the last thing that tied her to this place. It was the ground under her feet, and her feet were strong enough. She would not be run off by whispers or by the greed of men like Gibbons. The next day she walked to the mercantile with a new straightness to her spine. She needed blue fabric to mend the hostler's shirts. Sadie Miller was at the counter, her smile as thin and brittle as a wafer. "Well, look who it is," Sadie said, loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Come for another wagon load of provisions." "Just some fabric, Mrs. Miller," Mercy said, her voice calm and level. She pointed to a bolt of sturdy blue cotton. 5 yards of that, please." Sadie made a great show of unrolling the fabric.
5 yards. Gracious child, are you making a shirt or a tent?
The two men loafing by the Cracker Barrel snorted with laughter. Mercy met Sadie Miller's gaze without flinching. A small, almost imperceptible smile touched her lips.
"It's for the county men, Mrs. Miller," she said, her voice carrying a note of polite surprise. "Or did you think Sheriff Carter was the kind of man to let his deputies ride out in rags?"
The laughter died in the men's throats. Sadie's face flushed a dull, angry red. She had tried to make Mercy the butt of a joke, and Mercy had neatly turned it back on her, wrapping it in the authority of the sheriff himself. The dressmaker, a quiet woman who was in the store for thread, gave a small cough that sounded suspiciously like a stifled laugh. Sadie measured out the 5 yards, her movements jerky and angry, and took Mercy's money without another word. Meanwhile, Eli Carter was fighting a battle of his own. He was a man of the law, but he was beginning to feel like a man besieged by it. The system in Hollow Bend was a closed loop. Gibbons had the money, and the magistrate had the power, and they used both to their own advantage. After the granary incident, Eli had sent a report to the territorial marshal, detailing his suspicions about Gibbons and the magistrate's blatant corruption. He had received no reply. He was alone, a single point of order in a rising tide of chaos. He spent his nights reading his law books, searching for a tool, a lever, some statute he could use to pry Gibbons' grip off the town, but he found nothing. The law was a shield for the innocent, but it could also be a weapon in the hands of the clever and the corrupt. The confrontation came a week after the surveyors left. Eli was in his office, finishing his paperwork. When the door opened, Earl Gibbons walked in, followed by the magistrate. Gibbons was holding a piece of paper, and his face was alight with triumph. "Sheriff," he said, his voice dripping with satisfaction, "we have a matter that requires your attention." Eli looked up, his face impassive.
"Gibbons, magistrate."
"It has come to my attention," Gibbons continued, "that I have been laboring under a misapprehension regarding the Dunn property. It seems the matter of the debt was already settled." He laid the paper on Eli's desk. "By a mortgage agreement, signed by Miss Dunn herself, a month ago." Eli picked up the document. It was a standard mortgage contract, dating Patrick Dunn's land to Earl Gibbons in exchange for the cancellation of the $200 debt. At the bottom was a signature, written in a neat, feminine hand, "Mercy Dunn." "I was not aware of this," Eli said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Apparently not," the magistrate chimed in, his tone smug. "A simple business transaction. The girl must have forgotten. We are here to have you formally witness the transfer of the deed, as the document stipulates." At that moment, the door opened again. Mercy stood there, a basket of mending in her arms. She had come to return the mended shirts. She stopped short, her eyes taking in the scene, the triumphant look on Gibbons' face, the hostile neutrality of the magistrate, the grim tension in Eli's posture. "Miss Dunn," Gibbons said, turning to her with a predatory smile. "Just the person. We were just discussing your signature." Eli slid the paper across the desk toward her.
"Mercy, did you sign this?"
Mercy looked at the document. She saw the familiar legal language, her father's name, the name of the man who was trying to ruin her, and she saw the signature at the bottom. It looked like her handwriting. It was a skillful imitation, catching the loops and slants of her own script, but it was not hers. "No,"
she said, her voice clear and strong. "I have never seen this paper before in my life. I did not sign it."
Now, girl," the magistrate said, shaking his head in mock sadness. "A signed contract is a signed contract. Your memory must be failing you."
"My memory is fine,"
Mercy said, her gaze locked on Gibbons.
"This is a forgery."
Gibbons laughed. "A short, ugly sound. A serious accusation. Can you prove it? The signature is a perfect match. I have a dozen examples of your father's receipts, signed by you. Any expert would agree."
He was right. It was a masterful fake, her word against a piece of paper that looked, for all the world, to be genuine. She felt a cold knot of fear in her stomach. They had her trapped. Eli had been silent, studying the document, his eyes narrowed to slits. He looked from the signature to Mercy's face, then back again. He said nothing for a long moment. The only sound in the room, the ticking of the clock on the wall. Finally, he folded the paper carefully and placed it in a drawer in his desk. He locked the drawer and put the key in his pocket. "This document is now evidence in an official investigation," he said, his voice flat and hard as iron. He stood up, his small frame seeming to fill the room. He looked directly at Gibbons, and for the first time, Mercy saw a flicker of uncertainty in the bigger man's eyes. "This is an outrage," the magistrate blustered. "You have no authority." "My authority," Eli cut in, his voice dropping to a near whisper, "is to investigate the crime of forgery, which has just been alleged in my presence. This meeting is over." He walked to the door and held it open. "Gentlemen," Gibbons and the magistrate, flustered and angry, had no choice but to leave. As they passed, Gibbons shot Mercy a look of pure venom. The door closed behind them, leaving Mercy and Eli alone in the charged silence. Mercy stood frozen, her knuckles white where she gripped the mending basket. They had almost done it. They had almost stolen the last thing she had in the world with a lie and a bottle of ink. Eli turned to her, his gray eyes unreadable. The anger was gone, replaced by a quiet, unyielding resolve. "He will not get that land." "Mercy," he said. It was not a boast or a promise. It was a statement of fact. "I will find the man who forged this. I will find the proof. I will see this through to the end." He had not called her Miss Dunn. He had called her Mercy. And in the quiet of the small, dusty office, with the weight of the law and the greed of the town pressing in on them, his words were not just about a piece of land anymore. They were a vow. The weeks following the discovery of the forged document were a quiet, simmering war. Eli Carter worked relentlessly, sending letters to a contact in the territorial capital, trying to find a handwriting expert, a man who could prove the signature was a fake. But the capital was far away, and the law moved at the speed of a tired horse. In Hollow Bend, Earl Gibbons walked with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won. He made no further move on the land, content to let the fraudulent papers sit in the sheriff's locked drawer, a time bomb waiting to explode. The town watched, and the whispers twisted into new shapes. The story of the forgery had leaked, as all stories did in a town so small. Now, Mercy was not just the sheriff's pet project. She was the center of his obsession. They said he was neglecting his duties, chasing a phantom forger, all for the sake of the big woman who cooked his meals. The weight of their judgment was a constant pressure, a physical thing she felt in the air around her. The midday sun on the main street was a physical blow, hammering the dust into a shimmering haze. Mercy walked from the livery toward the mercantile, her shopping list clutched in her hand. The street was crowded. A stagecoach had just pulled in, and its passengers were stretching their legs, blinking in the fierce light. From the saloon, the sound of loud laughter and a badly played piano spilled out into the street. A group of men, cowhands mostly, were drinking on the porch, their faces slick with sweat and cheap whiskey. Among them was Cole, the man who had tried to burn the granary,
out of jail and apparently suffering no ill effects from his brief incarceration. As Mercy drew level with the saloon, Cole caught sight of her. A malicious grin spread across his face. He nudged the man next to him. "Well, look what the cat dragged in," he bellowed, his voice carrying across the street. "The biggest prize in the whole county." Mercy kept walking, her gaze fixed ahead, her face a stoic mask, but her heart began to beat a slow, heavy rhythm of dread. Cole was not to be ignored. He swaggered off the porch and into the middle of the street, blocking her path. "Hold on there, sweetheart. Where's the fire?" A few of his companions followed, forming a loose, menacing circle. "Boys," Cole announced to the town at large, "I feel a bit of sport coming on. Let's have ourselves an auction." Laughter erupted from the saloon porch. People on the street stopped to watch, their faces a mixture of curiosity and cruel amusement. Sadie Miller appeared in the doorway of the mercantile, a look of smug satisfaction on her face. "What'll we sell?" one of the cowhands slurred. "Why, a prize," Cole declared, gesturing dramatically toward Mercy. "A private dinner with our celebrated county cook, a woman of substance. You might say, I'll open the bidding at 50 cents for the pleasure of watching her eat." The street exploded with laughter. It was a raw, ugly sound that seemed to beat against Mercy from all sides. She stood frozen in the middle of the circle, the sun beating down on her head. Her carefully constructed walls of silence and dignity were crumbling into dust. This was worse than the first auction. This was not about a debt. This was about pure, unadulterated cruelty, a spectacle for the town's entertainment. She felt 100 pairs of eyes on her, stripping her bare, weighing her, judging her, and finding her wanting. Then, through the wall of noise, a quiet sound, the click of a door opening. Eli Carter stepped out of his office. He did not run, he did not shout. He walked into the street with his steady, uneven gait, and the crowd fell silent and parted before him as if he were Moses and they were the Red Sea. He ignored the drunken men. He ignored the gawking townspeople. His gray eyes were fixed on Mercy's face, and in their depths, she saw not pity, but a cold, hard anger that was more terrifying than all the laughter combined. He stopped in front of her. The circle of men shuffled back, suddenly sobered by his presence. In the profound silence, Eli did something strange. He reached up, took off his worn hat, and placed it carefully on the edge of a horse trough nearby. He stood for a moment, his slight limp more pronounced without the hat to balance his silhouette. Then, he leaned in close to Mercy, so close his shoulder brushed hers, and he lowered his head to her ear. The whole town strained to hear, but his voice was a whisper, meant only for her. "The whole town laughed at your weight," he murmured, his breath warm against her skin. The celebrated sheriff whispered, "Perfect for me." The words hit her with the force of a physical shock. They were so unexpected, so absurd, so intensely personal in the midst of this public humiliation, that a wild, hysterical sound bubbled up in her throat. It was half a sob, half a laugh. A single tear escaped and traced a clean path through the dust on her cheek. He had taken their ugliest insult and turned it into the most intimate of compliments. Eli straightened up. He did not look at Mercy again. He turned his cool, gray gaze on Cole. "You will apologize to the lady," he said, his voice quiet but carrying the unmistakable ring of command. Cole, his courage bolstered by whiskey and the audience, sneered, "Apologize for what?" "A bit of fun. What's it to you?" "Carter, you her guardian angel now." "I am the sheriff of this town," Eli said, his voice dropping even lower. "And you are disturbing the peace. Apologize. Now." Cole spat in the dust near Eli's boots. "Go to hell." The motion was too fast to follow. Eli's right hand, which had been resting loosely at his side, came up in a short, brutal arc. It was not a wild swing. It was a precise, economical blow, delivered with the full force of his body. His knuckles connected with Cole's jaw with a sickening crack. Cole's eyes rolled back in his head, and he crumpled to the ground in a boneless heap, unconscious before he hit the dirt. A collective gasp went through the crowd. The other cowhands stared, their mouths agape. Eli Carter looked down at the man on the ground, then back at his stunned companions, his expression unreadable. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt and bent down, efficiently securing the unconscious man's wrists. "He's under arrest," Eli announced to the silent street. He looked at the other men. "The rest of you, get back in the saloon before I decide to arrest you for unlawful assembly." The men scrambled back onto the porch as if they had been goaded with a hot iron. Eli hoisted Cole's limp form over his shoulder and started walking toward the jail, his limp more pronounced under the dead weight. As he passed Mercy, he paused for a fraction of a second. He did not speak, but his eyes met hers. In that one look, she understood everything. He had not acted out of some misguided sense of chivalry, as if she were a helpless maiden he needed to rescue. He had acted as the law. He had defended a citizen from public harassment. He had demanded an apology not because her feelings were hurt, but because her dignity had been assaulted. He had not saved her. He had respected her. He had seen her as a person worthy of the law's protection. And he had provided it, swiftly and without question. And, in that moment, the deep, steady foundation of trust she felt for him solidified into something stronger, something warmer, something that felt terrifyingly like love. That night, the town was quiet, too quiet. The story of the sheriff's punch had spread like wildfire. Gibbons, seeing his pawn so publicly humiliated and his own authority challenged, was said to be in a black rage. Mercy sat in her small shed, the memory of Eli's whispered words replaying in her mind, a secret warmth in the cool night air. The smell of smoke was the first warning. It was a faint, acrid scent that crept in through the cracks in the wooden walls. She sat up, her senses on high alert. The smell grew stronger, thicker. She scrambled to the door and threw it open. The night sky to her right, over the livery stable, was glowing a hellish orange. Fire! The cry went up from somewhere down the street. Mercy didn't hesitate. The horses, the county's horses, and Eli's own mare, were trapped in there. She ran. The heat hit her like a physical wall as she neared the stable. Flames were already licking up the dry wooden walls, and thick black smoke poured from the roof. A small group of men were forming a bucket brigade from the well, a futile effort against the roaring inferno. She saw the main stable doors were still barred. Silas and Matthew were nowhere to be seen. Panic seized her. She grabbed the heavy wooden beam that barred the doors and pulled. It was heavy, hot to the touch, but she put her full weight into it, her muscles straining. The beam scraped, resisted, and then finally gave way. She threw the doors open. A wave of superheated air and smoke billowed out, driving her back. Inside, the horses were screaming, their eyes wild with terror. She pulled her shawl up over her nose and mouth and plunged into the chaos. The air was thick and unbreathable, filled with flying sparks. "Go get out!" she yelled, her voice a raw croak. She slapped the rumps of the nearest horses, driving them toward the open doors. They bolted out into the night, their manes smoking. Most of the horses were out, but one, Eli's mare, was tangled in her lead rope, rearing and pulling against it in blind panic. Mercy fought her way through the smoke to the stall. The heat was unbearable. A section of the hayloft above her was engulfed in flames. She worked at the knot with frantic, clumsy fingers, her eyes streaming. Just as she pulled the rope free, a great groan came from above. A massive burning rafter was beginning to give way. Suddenly, an arm like a band of iron clamped around her waist. "Mercy, get out!" It was Eli. His face was black with soot, his eyes wild. He yanked her backward, away from the terrified horse, just as the rafter crashed down where she had been standing, sending a volcano of sparks up into the smoke. He half dragged, half carried her out of the burning building as the mare, finally free, galloped out past them. They stumbled out into the open, collapsing to their knees on the dusty ground, gasping for air. At that moment, the sky opened up. A sudden, violent downpour began to fall, hissing as it struck the burning wreckage. Rain drenched them in seconds, plastering their clothes to their skin, washing the soot from their faces. They knelt there, in the mud and the rain, surrounded by the smell of smoke and wet ash, the sound of the dying fire in their ears. Eli reached out and pushed a stray, wet strand of hair from her face. His hand was trembling slightly. She looked at him, and in the flickering light of the flames, she saw her own fear, her own relief, her own dawning love reflected in his eyes. The trust had been there for weeks, but in the heart of the fire, it had been forged into something new, something unbreakable. The morning after the fire, Hollow Bend was a town of ghosts, shrouded in a mist of rain and wood smoke. The livery stable was a skeleton of blackened timbers, steaming in the damp air. The smell of wet ash was everywhere, a grim reminder of the night's violence. The townsfolk who gathered to stare at the wreckage spoke in hushed, suspicious tones. Fires did not just happen, not even in a tinderbox town during a drought. Fires were set. By noon, the magistrate had arrived from the county seat, his face a mask of solemn authority. He stood with Earl Gibbons by the ruins, the two of them a portrait of civic concern. Eli Carter, his face still smudged with soot, stood apart, his posture rigid with a barely suppressed fury. The investigation was a sham, a piece of theater for the town's benefit. The magistrate declared that the destruction of county property was a grave matter, and pending a full inquiry, it was his duty to suspend the sheriff. The loss of the stable, he implied, was a sign of incompetence, a failure of leadership. He took Eli's badge, a small silver star, and dropped it into his pocket. The public mood, which had been briefly sympathetic to the sheriff who had lost his horse's stable, turned sour and ugly. The whispers found a new target. It was all her fault. Trouble had followed Mercy Dunn into town like a shadow. First, the public auction, then the fight in the street, and now this. She was a bad omen, a catalyst for chaos. When she walked to the mercantile, people turned their backs. Sadie Miller informed her, her voice cold, that all county accounts were suspended until the investigation was complete. Mercy was cut off, isolated, blamed for a crime she had not committed. She found Eli in the small room behind the sheriff's office that served as his living quarters. He was sitting on the edge of his narrow bed, staring at the empty spot on his vest where the badge should have been. The room was sparse, almost monastic a bed, a small table, a single chair, and a shelf of law books. He looked smaller without the badge, more vulnerable. The limp seemed more pronounced. Mercy said nothing. She went to the small stove in the corner, found the coffee pot, and set about making a fresh pot. The simple, domestic act was the only comfort she could offer. The wind had picked up again, rattling the window pane in its frame. When the coffee was ready, she poured 2 cups and handed one to him. He took it, his fingers brushing hers. "They're blaming you," he said, his voice flat. He wasn't looking at her, but at the floor. "I know," she said. "It's Gibbons. He said he paid someone, Red Jack's men, I'd wager, to make me look incompetent, to discredit me before I can prove that forgery." He fell silent again, drinking his coffee. The wind howled, a lonely, mournful sound. Mercy felt a strange sense of peace in the small, quiet room. Out there, the town was full of hate and suspicion. In here, there was only the truth, spoken plainly between 2 people. Eli finally looked up, his gray eyes meeting hers. They were tired, but the resolve in them was unshaken. "This is not a good place for you right now. Mercy, it's not safe." "Where would I go?" she asked simply. He put his cup down on the floor beside him. "I've been thinking, this shed you're living in, it's not right, and my name being connected to yours, it's causing you harm." He paused, and for the first time, she saw a flicker of uncertainty in his face. "There's only one way to make it right, to give you the protection of the law in a way they can't take away." He took a breath. "I'm not a man for fancy words. I have this room, a small savings, and a fight on my hands that I might not win. I can't offer you silks or a fine house. All I can offer is my name, and a promise that as long as I'm alive, no one in this town will ever make you bow your head in shame again." He looked at her, his gaze direct and honest. "Mercy Dunn, I am asking you to share my name and my house. I am asking you to be my wife." Mercy stared at him, her heart a wild, fluttering bird in her chest. It was the most practical, unromantic proposal a woman had ever received, and it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. He was not offering her love sonnets. He was offering her a shield. He was offering her partnership. He was offering her a place to stand beside him, not behind him. "Eli Carter," she said, testing the sound of his name on her tongue. "Yes." They were married 2 days later in the small, wooden church at the edge of town. Reverend Pike, a tall, stooped man with kind, worried eyes, presided over the ceremony. He had hesitated when Eli had first approached him, his fear of Gibbons and the magistrate warring with his sense of duty. But he had seen the cruelty in the town, and he had seen the quiet dignity of the woman who had been its target. His conscience had won. Mercy wore her only good dress, a simple brown cotton that she had scrubbed and ironed to perfection. Eli wore his town clothes, also scrubbed and brushed. Their only witnesses were Silas and Matthew from the stable, who stood awkwardly in the back of the church, their hats clutched in their hands. The ceremony was short and simple. They spoke the vows in clear, steady voices, the ancient words echoing in the empty church, when the Reverend pronounced them man and wife. Eli did not kiss her. He simply took her hand, his rough, calloused palm enclosing hers, and held it tight. That night, she moved her few belongings from the shed into Eli's small room. It felt strange and intimate. Her dress now hung on a peg next to his shirt. Her brush and comb sat on the small table next to his razor. The room was no longer just his. It was theirs. He lit the lamp, casting a warm, golden glow over the simple room. An awkward silence fell between them. They were husband and wife, but they were also two near strangers who had been thrown together by circumstance and a shared sense of justice. He gestured to the bed, which suddenly seemed to fill the entire room. "It's not much," he said, his voice a little hoarse. "The mattress is stuffed with corn husks." She smiled, a small, shy smile. "I'm used to corn husks." He sat on the single chair, and she sat on the edge of the bed. He began to unlace his boots, his movements slow and deliberate. She saw him wince as he straightened his left leg. "The leg pains you," she said. It was a statement, not a question. He nodded, not looking at her. "Sometimes, when the weather changes, or when I've been on it too long." He finally got the boot off and began rubbing his ankle. "I apologize. I am not whole." Mercy looked at him, at this quiet, honorable man who was trying to apologize for his own scars. She stood up and walked the 2 steps that separated them. She knelt on the floor in front of him and gently took his foot in her hands. She began to massage the tense muscles of his calf, her strong, capable fingers working with a firm, soothing pressure. He stiffened in surprise. Then, slowly, he relaxed under her touch. He leaned his head back against the wall and closed his eyes. They stayed like that for a long time, in silence, with only the sound of the wind outside and the gentle creak of the floorboards. When she was done, she looked up at him. His eyes were open, and he was watching her with an expression of profound tenderness. He reached out and cupped her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. It was a gesture more intimate than any kiss. Later, lying in the narrow bed, the corn husk mattress rustling with every small movement, She felt the warmth of his body next to hers. He lay on his back, his hands laced behind his head, staring up at the dark ceiling. She lay on her side, facing him.
"Eli,"
she said softly.
"Yes, Mercy."
"That thing you whispered to me, in the street." He was silent for a moment. Then he said, his voice a low rumble in the darkness,
"I meant it."
She smiled in the dark and reached out, her hand finding his in the space between them. His fingers closed around hers, a solid, reassuring presence. They did not speak again. They simply lay there, hand in hand, listening to the wind. Two separate people who had just become one small, defiant island in the middle of a hostile town. The first snow came a week later, far too early in the season. It began as a cold, biting wind, and then the flakes started to fall, thick and wet and heavy. Within hours, the world was a sea of white. The unseasonal blizzard was a disaster for the ranchers. The temperature plummeted, and the streams and water troughs froze solid. Cattle, confused by the sudden cold, began to drift with the wind, getting lost in the blinding snow. News came that a small family on the outskirts of town, the Petersons, had lost a calf, their only one, with a father laid up with a broken leg. They had no one to search for it. The men of the town were busy trying to save their own herds, fighting their way through waist-deep drifts to get feed to their starving cattle. Mercy heard the news at the blacksmith's forge, where she had been allowed to set up a temporary kitchen. She looked out at the swirling white landscape. She thought of the Peterson family, of their desperation. She thought of her own strength, the endurance that came from her size. She went to the dressmaker's shop. The woman, whose name was Helen, was the one who had laughed at Mercy's joke in the mercantile. Mercy found her trying to board up a window that had been broken by the wind. "I'm going out to look for the Petersons' calf," Mercy said without preamble. "I'll need help." Helen stared at her as if she were mad. "In this, you'll freeze to death." "The calf will freeze to death if we don't," Mercy replied. "Are you coming or not?" Something in Mercy's calm determination struck a chord. Helen looked at Mercy, then at her own capable hands. She nodded. They went to 2 other houses, gathering 2 more women, wives of ranchers who were out with the main herds, armed with heavy coats, ropes, and a shared sense of purpose. The 4 women set out into the storm. It was brutal work. The wind drove the snow into their faces like tiny needles, and the cold was a physical pain. But Mercy led them with an unflagging resolve. She broke trail through the deep drifts, her solid frame a bulwark against the wind. She knew animals. She knew how they thought, how they would seek shelter. She led them along a line of cottonwoods that followed the frozen creek bed. They found the calf huddled in a thicket, shivering and half-frozen, its mother lying dead nearby, likely from the fall into the gully. The calf was too weak to walk. Without a word, Mercy bent down, and with a grunt of effort, lifted the animal onto her broad shoulders. The other women stared in awe. The calf was a dead weight, but Mercy stood tall, braced herself against the wind, and began the long, slow walk back to the Petersons' farm. They returned at dusk, exhausted, cold, but triumphant. Mrs. Peterson wept with gratitude as they brought the calf into the warm kitchen. As they were warming themselves by the fire, a boy came bursting in, his face white with fear. He was looking for Mercy. "Mrs. Carter," he gasped. "It's Reverend Pike. He's gone. Someone's taken him." He thrust a piece of folded paper into her hand. It was a crude, hastily scrawled note. Her blood ran cold as she read the words. "We have the preacher. You have the paper. The forged mortgage. Leave it at the old hanging tree on the salt flat by midnight. Or the preacher joins his maker. No, Sheriff. Come alone." It was signed with a crude drawing of a grinning Red Jack. The world shrank to the size of the small, lamp-lit room and the piece of dirty paper in Mercy's hand. The scrawled words were a death sentence, not just for the Reverend, but for the fragile hope that had begun to grow between her and Eli. He stood by the window, peering out into the swirling snow, his body a study in coiled tension. He had no badge, no authority, no posse to call upon. He was just a man, and the town he had sworn to protect had turned its back on him. "They want me to come alone," Mercy said, her voice a low, steady thing in the quiet room. She folded the note, the rough paper crinkling in her fingers. "They want the forged mortgage." "No," Eli said, turning from the window. His face was a mask of cold fury. "This is my fight. They're trying to draw you out, to use you against me. I'll go." And do what she challenged, her gaze unwavering. "You'll ride into a trap, Eli. They'll kill you, and they'll kill the Reverend anyway. The note says, 'No sheriff.' You are the sheriff, badge or no badge. They know you won't stand by. This is the only way." "I will not use you as bait." The words were torn from him, raw and absolute. "You won't be," she countered, her mind racing, piecing together the bones of a desperate plan. "They think they're using me, so we let them think it. They want the paper. They don't say it has to be the real one." A flicker of understanding crossed his face. "A copy." "A copy," she confirmed. "I'll make one. They'll have to get close to tell the difference. By then, it'll be too late." She walked over to him, placing a hand on his arm. His muscles were rigid beneath his shirt. "They told me to come alone. They won't be expecting you. That's our advantage. Eli, it's the only one we have." He looked down at her, at the quiet strength in her face, the clear, intelligent light in her eyes. He was a man who trusted in the law, in plans, in the weight of his own authority. All of that had been stripped away. All he had left was this woman, his wife, and her impossible, terrifying courage. To agree went against every protective instinct he possessed, but to refuse was to condemn a good man to death. He gave a single, reluctant nod. The next hour was a blur of tense preparation. Eli found paper and a pen, and Mercy sat at the small table, the lamp casting a circle of warm light around her, with the original forgery beside her. She began to write. Her hand, usually so steady when kneading dough or mending cloth, was rock solid now. She copied the intricate, looping signature that was meant to be hers, a perfect imitation of a lie. When she was done, the two documents, the real and the fake, were nearly indistinguishable. Eli checked his pistol, his movements spare and efficient. He moved with a grim purpose that frightened her more than the kidnapper's note. He was no longer just a man. He was a hunter, stripped of everything but his skill and his rage. He looked at her as she folded the false document. "If anything happens," he began, his voice rough. "Nothing will happen?" she said, cutting him off with a finality that allowed for no argument. "We will get the Reverend, and we will come home." The salt flat was a place of ghosts, a vast, white desert under a sliver of moon. The blizzard had passed, leaving behind a frozen, silent world. The wind had not died, though. It swept across the open space, a physical force that sliced through their coats and stole the breath from their lungs. The snow-covered salt crackled under their boots with a sound like breaking glass. The moon was a chip of cold, white stone in an ink-black sky, offering just enough light to see the desolation that stretched for miles in every direction. This was a second enemy, this unforgiving land, as cold and as merciless as the men they were hunting. They moved in silence. Eli a few paces ahead, his dark form a moving shadow against the snow. He walked with a purpose that defied his limp, his eyes scanning the horizon. Mercy followed, her own steady pace a rhythm of quiet determination. They were a single, isolated unit against the vast, howling emptiness of the night. The hanging tree was a gnarled, skeletal silhouette against the stars. 100 yards from it stood a derelict line shack, a dark blot on the landscape with a faint, yellow light glowing in its single window. Eli stopped, holding up a hand. "They'll be in the shack," he whispered, his voice snatched away by the wind. "You go to the tree, leave the paper. Walk back the way you came. Do not look at the shack. Do not run. I'll circle around from the west."
"Be careful, Eli," she murmured.
He touched her face, his fingers cold but gentle.
"You too, Mercy."
And then he was gone, melting into the shadows and the snow. Mercy took a deep breath, the frigid air searing her lungs, and began to walk toward the tree. Every step felt a mile long. The shack was a baleful eye, watching her. She could feel the gaze of the men inside, could feel their anticipation, their greed. She reached the tree, its bare branches clawing at the sky. A small rock sat at its base, as the note had instructed. She placed the folded paper on top of it, then turned and began to walk away, her heart pounding a frantic, desperate rhythm against her ribs. Her part was not over. As she walked, she let her eyes scan the ground around the shack. She saw what she was hoping for, a small, lean-to shed built against the back wall of the main building. Its door held shut by a thick wooden beam dropped into 2 iron brackets. It was crude, but strong. She also saw a long, sturdy fence post lying half-buried in a snowdrift nearby. Eli was in position, a dark shape pressed against the far corner of the shack. Just out of the light from the window, he was waiting for the men to come out, to expose themselves. Mercy changed her plan. Waiting was a risk. She began to walk, not directly away, but in a wide, slow arc that brought her around to the back of the shack, keeping the main building between her and the window. The wind covered the sound of her footsteps. She reached the shed and the discarded fence post. It was heavy, solid oak, but her fear gave her a strength she did not know she possessed. Hoisting the post, she wedged one end under the heavy wooden bar on the shed door, using a snow-covered rock as a fulcrum. She put her shoulder into it, her full weight, her entire being focused on this single, desperate act of leverage. The wood groaned, the iron brackets strained. With a sharp crack, the bar splintered and sprang from its holders. The shed door swung open. The sound was the signal. 2 men burst from the main shack, rifles in hand, their faces contorted in alarm. Before they could even register what was happening, 2 shots rang out, sharp and deafening in the frozen air. The men fell, their surprise turning to nothing as they crumpled into the snow. From inside the shack, there was a shout of fear and rage. A third figure crashed through the back window in a spray of glass and snow and took off into the darkness, a running shadow against the white landscape. Eli raised his pistol to fire again, but the man was too fast, swallowed by the night. Mercy ran to the main shack. Eli was already inside. Reverend Pike was tied to a chair, a gag in his mouth, his eyes wide with a mixture of terror and relief. As Eli cut him free, Mercy's eyes fell upon a piece of paper lying on the floor near the shattered window, dropped in the third man's hasty escape. She picked it up. It was not a ransom note. It was a handwritten letter. The price is agreed. It read, "Get the document and burn the evidence. The town and the railroad route will be ours. No witnesses." The signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Earl Gibbons. Earl. They had him. The proof, cold and clear, was in her hand. Their return to Hollow Bend before dawn was not triumphant. It was grim. The Reverend, wrapped in a blanket, was weak but unharmed. Eli carried the letter from Gibbons tucked inside his coat. They were not just husband and wife returning from a rescue. They were the law, coming to reclaim their town. But the town was waiting for them. As they reached the main street, a group of men stepped out of the shadows. It was the magistrate, and with him were 2 rough-looking men wearing hastily pinned deputy badges. They were Gibbons' men. "Eli Carter," the magistrate declared, his voice booming with false authority. "You are under arrest." Eli stopped, his hand instinctively going to his hip where his pistol should be. Mercy had it, tucked safely away. On what charge, he demanded, his voice dangerously low. "For the murder of 2 county men," the magistrate said, a smug smile playing on his lips. I deputized those men this evening to form a search party for our missing reverend. It seems you found them first."
The lie was so audacious, so breathtakingly evil, that Mercy could only stare. The townspeople, drawn from their beds by the commotion, began to gather. They saw the suspended sheriff, the exhausted reverend, the two armed deputies, and they heard the magistrate's pronouncement. They did not see the letter in Eli's coat. They only saw what they were told to see. "That is a lie," Reverend Pike said, his voice weak but clear. "Those men were my captors. Sheriff Carter saved my life." The magistrate waved a dismissive hand. "The man is delirious from his ordeal. We will sort this out with a proper trial." He gestured to his men. "Take his gun. Cuff him." Eli did not resist. He knew it was useless. He was caught in their web. As they clamped the iron cuffs on his wrists, he looked at Mercy, his eyes conveying a silent, desperate message. "Protect the letter." They led him away, toward the jail he once commanded. The townspeople watched, their faces hard and unforgiving in the cold morning light. They offered no help, no words of support. They turned their backs, one by one, leaving Mercy to stand alone in the street. She watched as the heavy wooden door of the jail closed, shutting her husband away from her. The silver star they had taken from him was gone, but another star, one of fierce, unyielding resolve, was kindled in its place. She stood before the jail, the frozen ground solid beneath her feet, and she did not move. She would not back down. The fight was not over. It had just begun. The trial of Eli Carter was held in the church, the only building in Hollow Bend large enough to hold the town's collective curiosity and thirst for judgment. The pews were packed, a sea of hostile, sunburnt faces. The air was thick with the smell of dust, sweat, and cheap hypocrisy. At the front, sitting behind the pulpit as if it were a judge's bench, was the magistrate, his face flushed with self-importance. Earl Gibbons sat in the front pew, a smug, satisfied spectator at a drama of his own making. In the defendant's chair, his wrists still cuffed, sat Eli, his face a granite mask of control, his gray eyes missing nothing. Mercy sat alone in the second pew. The space around her was empty, a circle of condemnation. She felt their stares, their whispers, 100 tiny needles pricking her skin. But beneath the fear, a cold, hard anger was taking root. She held a worn, cloth-bound ledger book in her lap, her knuckles white where she gripped it. The trial was a mockery of justice, swift and brutal. The magistrate called the two men he had deputized. They lied with practiced ease, telling a story of how they had found the Reverend's trail and were ambushed by a crazed Eli Carter, who shot their companions in cold blood. Reverend Pike was called next. He tried to tell the truth, his voice still weak from his ordeal, describing his kidnapping and the rescue. The magistrate cut him off, patting the air with a dismissive hand. "Clearly the man is suffering from exposure and shock," he announced to the room. "His testimony is unreliable. We have 2 sworn officers of the law who saw what happened. The case is clear." He was about to call for the jury, a hand-picked selection of Gibbons' cronies, to deliver their verdict when Mercy stood up. Her movement was slow, deliberate, drawing every eye in the room. "I wish to testify," she said, her voice clear and carrying to the back of the church. The magistrate looked at her, a cruel smile touching his lips. He saw an opportunity for one last piece of sport, a final humiliation. The cook. What could you possibly have to say? "I am the defendant's wife," she said, her voice gaining strength, "and I am a witness to the motive for this entire affair." A murmur went through the crowd. The magistrate, intrigued, gestured her forward. "Very well. Let the town hear the woman's story." Mercy walked to the front of the room, not to a witness stand, for there was none, but to stand on the open floor before the pulpit. She did not look at Eli. She looked at the jury, at the faces of the people who had judged her from the moment she arrived. "This is not about what happened on the salt flat last night," she began. "This is about a piece of land,
My father's land. And it is about this. She held up the forged mortgage document, which Eli had given her for safekeeping. This is a contract that says I signed my land over to Mr. Gibbons. The signature is my name, but the hand is not mine. This is a forgery. Gibbons leapt to his feet. Objection, this is slander. The document is legal and binding. Is it? Mercy's voice cut through his blustering. She held up the ledger book from her lap. This is my kitchen account book. I have kept it every day since I started working for the county. In it, I write down every pound of flour, every side of bacon, every sack of beans I purchase for the livery. She opened the book. The pages were filled with her neat, practical script. The mortgage is dated the 10th of last month. It is notarized at the county seat. A full day's ride from here. But on that day, she continued, her finger tracing a line in the book. My ledger says that at 9 in the morning, I purchased 20 pounds of flour from Miller's Mercantile. At noon, I served a beef stew to the hustlers. And at 4 in the afternoon, I took a portion of that stew to the blacksmith because his back was giving him trouble. She looked up, her gaze sweeping across the silent room. I was here, in Hollow Bend, all day. I was not at the county seat. I could not have signed that paper. The magistrate sputtered, trying to regain control. A kitchen diary. That is your proof. A book of scribbles. It is not just scribbles, a new voice said. The stagecoach driver, a man named Henderson, stood up from the back of the room. I remember that day. I saw her at the livery myself, arguing with the boy Matthew about the proper way to stack hay. Then another voice, this one from the blacksmith, a large, gentle man with a stooped shoulder. She did bring me that stew. Best I'd had in a month. My back was hurting something fierce that afternoon. A third voice, small and timid, came from a young woman who sometimes played the banjo for coins in the saloon. She gave me a nickel that morning to fetch some thread from the dressmaker's. I remember because it was the first coin I'd made all day. One by one, they stood, the overlooked people of Hollow Bend, the ones who existed in the background of the town's dramas, the hostler Silas, the dressmaker Helen, the stable boy Matthew. They had all seen her. They had all received some small, unremembered act of kindness from her, and they were repaying it now, not with opinions or gossip, but with the simple, unshakable truth. The foundation of the magistrate's case was crumbling. The jury was looking at each other, their expressions shifting from certainty to doubt, furious. The magistrate turned his venom on Mercy. This is a conspiracy of vagrants and paupers, he snarled. And you, madam, are at the center of it. A woman of your considerable size must have a large appetite for tall tales as well as for groceries. The insult hung in the air, ugly and familiar. But this time, Mercy did not flinch. She did not retreat behind her wall of silence. She stood taller, her shoulders squared, and she looked directly at the man who thought he could diminish her. She spoke, and her voice was filled with a power that no one in that room had ever heard from her before. You are right, sir, she said, her voice ringing with a strange and terrible clarity. I am a heavy woman. I have a right to be. She took a step closer to the jury, her eyes burning with an intensity that made them shrink back. I am heavy with the weight of my father's debts, which I have been paying since the day he died. I am heavy with the work of running a kitchen, of baking bread before dawn and scrubbing pots after sundown. I am heavy with the scorn of this town, a weight I have carried every single day. I am as heavy as all the burdens I have carried for other people, and I am done carrying them in silence. The church was utterly still. Not a cough, not a shuffle of a boot, disturbed the profound silence. Every person in that room was looking at her, truly seeing her for the first time. Not as a caricature, but as a human being whose body was a testament to her own resilience. Into that silence stepped Reverend Pike. He was no longer hesitant or afraid. He held up a piece of paper, a receipt. While we are examining documents, he said, his voice firm. "Perhaps the court should examine this one." He handed it to the foreman of the jury. "This is a receipt for a generous donation, mister. Gibbons made to the magistrate's personal fund just last week. He said it was to ensure the continued proper administration of justice in this county." The foreman looked at the receipt, then at the letter from Red Jack, which Eli had given to the Reverend for safekeeping before he was arrested. The foreman's eyes widened. "The ink," he breathed, "and this smudge, it's the same." The connection was finally made, a flash of lightning that illuminated the entire conspiracy. Gibbons had bought the magistrate. The magistrate had protected Gibbons's criminals. And together, they had tried to steal Mercy's land and frame the one man who stood in their way. The foreman of the jury stood up. He was a simple rancher, a man of few words, but his face was a thundercloud of rage. He pointed a trembling finger, not at Eli, but at the magistrate on his pulpit. "He's the liar, he's the criminal." It was the spark that lit the fuse. The courtroom erupted. A wave of outrage swept through the pews as the townspeople, finally seeing the truth, turned on the men who had manipulated them. Earl Gibbons did not wait to see what would happen. He saw the hatred in the eyes of his neighbors, the crumbling of his carefully constructed empire. With a snarl of fury, he shoved his way through the stunned crowd, knocked over the blacksmith, and burst through the church doors. He ran for the livery, where his horse was tied. In the chaos, someone, the blacksmith, took the key from the magistrate's dazed deputies and unlocked Eli's cuffs. Another man pressed a gun belt into his hand. Eli strapped it on. The familiar weight a comfort and a reclamation. The authority flowed back into him, not from a tin star, but from the will of the people he had tried to serve. He looked across the chaotic room at Mercy. She was standing perfectly still in the middle of it all, her ledger book still clutched in her hands. Their eyes met, and in his gaze, she saw a look of such profound respect, of such deep and abiding love, that it took her breath away. But there was no time. Through the open church door, they could see the cloud of dust as Gibbons spurred his horse out of town, heading for the open country, for the ranch that was his fortress. The final battle was not over. It was just beginning. Out of the chaos of the church, a new kind of order was born. It was not the cold, brittle order of the magistrate's law, but the fierce, messy order of a community that had finally woken up. The blacksmith, his face grim, organized the posse. It was a strange collection of men, the stagecoach driver, old Silas from the livery, even the young banjo player, her instrument left behind in favor of a borrowed rifle. They were not lawmen, but they were men who had seen an injustice and were no longer willing to look away. Eli, his gun belt once again settled on his hips, gave them their orders, his voice crisp and clear. They rode out of town in a cloud of dust, a small band against a desperate man. Gibbons was heading for his ranch, a large, defensible property with a clear view of the surrounding plains. The wind, which had been a mournful companion for weeks, had turned into a malevolent enemy. It was a hot, dry wind that whipped the tall prairie grass into a frenzy and carried the scent of fire. Far to the south, a line of orange flickered against the horizon, a grass fire, small for now, but hungry. Mercy watched them go, a knot of fear tightening in her stomach. She felt useless, left behind. Then she saw the town's old water wagon, its barrel nearly full, sitting forgotten near the well. She looked at the smoldering horizon, then in the direction the posse had ridden. An idea, reckless and terrifying, took hold of her. She found Matthew, the stable boy, his face still pale from the day's events. "Help me with the horses," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. Together, they hitched a team to the heavy wagon. Mercy climbed onto the driver's seat, gathering the thick leather reins in her capable hands. She was not a rider, but she knew horses. She knew their strength and their fear. She clicked the reins, and the heavy wagon lurched forward. following the trail of the posse out onto the open prairie. The chase was a desperate race against time and the land itself. Gibbons was a good rider, pushing his horse mercilessly. But the posse was relentless, their anger a fuel that would not burn out. The wind was a constant roar in their ears, and the line of fire to the south was growing, spreading sideways, driven by the gale. The air grew thick and hazy, and the sun was a dull red coin in a smoky sky. Mercy saw them cresting a low rise, the posse closing the distance. She also saw the fire. It was no longer a distant threat. It was a wall of flame, moving fast, directly toward the path Gibbons and the posse would have to take. It was a trap laid by nature itself. She urged her team onward, the heavy wagon bumping and swaying over the rough ground. The horses were skittish, their eyes rolling at the smell of smoke. But Mercy's calm, steady voice and firm hand on the reins kept them from bolting. Eli saw the fire at the same time. He saw it would cut them off, trapping them between the flames and the fugitive. Gibbons saw it too. He laughed, a wild, triumphant sound that was snatched away by the wind, and spurred his horse toward the narrowing gap. Then, over the rise, came the water wagon, a lumbering, impossible sight in the middle of the prairie. Mercy was whipping the horses, her face set in a mask of grim determination, aiming the wagon not at the riders, but at the fire itself. "What is she doing?" the blacksmith yelled over the wind. Eli knew. He saw the insane, brilliant courage of her plan. She was going to make a fire break, a wet one. She drove the team at a gallop parallel to the line of flames, then turned the wagon hard. The horses screamed as the heat washed over them, but Mercy held them steady. She pulled the lever that opened the spigot at the back of the barrel, and a wide spray of water gushed out, soaking the dry grass in a dark, 10-foot-wide path. She drove them along the edge of the fire, creating a barrier, a shield of wet earth between them and the inferno. The heat was immense, the smoke choking, but she did not falter. She was a force of nature in her own right, standing against the flames, her solid form a symbol of unbreakable will. The posse, seeing the path she had cleared, spurred their horses through the gap, their faces a mixture of awe and disbelief. Gibbons was cornered. He reined in his horse, his back to a rock outcropping, the fire raging on one side, the posse closing in on the other. He was trapped. He pulled his pistol, his eyes wild with the fury of a defeated king. The posse drew up, their own guns raised, forming a loose semicircle. "It's over, Gibbons," Eli said, his voice calm and steady above the roar of the wind and the crackle of the flames. "There's nowhere left to run." Gibbons' wild eyes found Eli. His face, which had been a mask of smug superiority for so long, was now a twisted mess of hatred and despair. "This is your fault. Carter!" he snarled. "You and your fat wife. You ruined everything." He raised his pistol, ignoring the other men, his aim centering directly on Eli's chest. Time seemed to slow down. Mercy, having abandoned the wagon, was approaching from the side, her approach shielded by the rocks and the smoke. She saw the gun level, saw the madness in Gibbons' eyes. She did not scream, she did not think, she ran. She was not a graceful runner, but she was powerful. Her feet pounded the earth, each step a piston stroke of pure, focused energy. Gibbons heard her at the last second, his head turning in surprise. He saw a vision of righteous fury, a woman whose entire being was aimed at him like a cannonball. He had no time to shift his aim. She hit him with the full force of her body, a collision of bone and muscle and unstoppable momentum. The shot went wide, a harmless crack in the roaring chaos. Gibbons was lifted from the saddle, his grip on the horse and the gun broken, and he crashed to the ground with a cry of pain and shock. He lay there, the wind knocked out of him, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle beneath him. Mercy stood over him, her chest heaving, her feet planted firmly on the ground she had refused to surrender. She had used the very thing they had mocked, her weight, her substance, and turned it into the weapon that saved the man she loved. The fire burned itself out against the creek bed, and a sudden shift in the wind sent the remaining smoke scudding away across the plains. In the quiet aftermath, Eli snapped the handcuffs on Earl Gibbon's unbroken wrist. The posse gathered, their faces grim but victorious. The reign of greed in Hollow Bend was over. A few weeks later, word came that the railroad, spooked by the legal troubles and the fire, had chosen a different route, one that bypassed the town completely. The land fever broke, and the price of dirt went back to being just the cost of the sweat it took to work it. Eli's silver star was officially returned to him in a quiet ceremony in front of the rebuilt livery stable. But he said the only authority he truly needed was the trust of the good people in his town. Mercy, with a loan from the now honest county coffers, bought the old saloon, which had been shuttered after its owner fled with Gibbon's cronies. She scrubbed it clean of the lingering smell of cheap whiskey and desperation, and opened an eatery and stagecoach stop. Above the door, she hung a simple, hand-carved wooden sign, Steady Mercy. And beneath the name, Eli had carefully carved a motto they had decided on together: "Strength is found in what we bear for one another." It became a place of refuge. The food was good and plentiful, the coffee was always hot, and Mercy presided over it all with a quiet, unshakable calm. She was still a big woman, but now, when people looked at her, they saw not her size, but her strength. They saw the woman who had faced down their scorn, who had saved a life with her courage, and who had stood against a fire to clear a path for justice. One cool autumn afternoon, a year later, Eli and Mercy sat on the porch of their small house, which they had built next to the eatery. The sun was warm on their faces, and a comfortable silence lay between them. They watched as a wagon rattled into town, carrying a new family, a man and a woman, their faces thin and etched with worry, their shoulders stooped with the weariness of the road. They looked lost and afraid, strangers in a strange land. Mercy watched them for a long moment. Then she stood up, her movements slow and purposeful. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the door of her kitchen. She pushed it open, letting the warm, welcoming scent of baking bread spill out into the street. The circle of respect was about to begin again. Thank you for listening to our story. We invite you to comment with where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. Please subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and support us further by pressing the hype button so this story and others like it can be heard by more people.